There's a higher probability that we have another world war because that's how the international cartel of private central banks stays in power, stays rich, and enslaves the world. 111 years ago, on December 23rd, 1913, is when the United States' third private central bank was created, the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is not a federal entity. It is completely separate from the government altogether. And the Federal Reserve has no reserves. It doesn't reserve anything. It is a private central bank that is part of an international cartel of private central banks that manufacture wars and kill anyone who tries to dismantle or undermine them. Check it out. Private central banks, like the Federal Reserve, have been starting wars to force their banking systems onto other nations for centuries. And up until recently, we had no way to escape their corrupt, rigged, fiat currency pyramid scheme. Let's learn about how we got here in the first place. How we got to this point in modern times, where we do not learn about money in school, where we are told lies about history, where we have almost no time to do anything besides work because we constantly have hardly any money or freedom, and how it was all by design. And in this extremely important video, we are going to explore a timeline of events from an article called All Banks Are Bankers' Wars by Michael Rivero that have led to what is happening now. The orchestrated systematic destruction of the world as we know it by globalists and private central banks, starting with the American Revolution. Let's hit it. The American Revolution was primarily inspired by King George III's Currency Act, which forced colonists to conduct business using only printed banknotes borrowed from the Bank of England, a private central bank, at a costly interest rate. And what most people don't know is that the colonies had created their own money called the colonial scrip, and it was interest-free, wealth-based money issued by the colonies themselves. Here's a famous quote from Benjamin Franklin describing how it worked. That is simple. In our colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power and we have no interest to pay. Simple enough, right? And it worked great from when it was created in 1750 until 1764, when the Bank of England, a private central bank, and their bought and paid for king, made it illegal. Here's another quote from Benjamin Franklin following the Currency Act. The colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability of colonists to get power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of King George III and the international bankers was the prime reason for the Revolutionary War. Very interesting. So after the Revolutionary War, the founders and first government of the United States actually took steps to try to prevent another private central bank from interfering with their new country and its citizens. And this is crazy, check it out. Here's an important telling quote from Thomas Jefferson, basically predicting our current situation hundreds of years beforehand. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs. And here we are, lots of people not owning property, a home, or hardly anything. Here's another quote by John Adams in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. All the perplexities, confusion, and distresses in America arise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, nor for the want of honor or virtue, as much from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. I mean, here's a quote directly from the governor of the Bank of England between 1920 and 1944, Montagu Norman, addressing the United States Bank with the same exact blueprint and game plan the current private central bankers use today. Check it out. Capital must protect itself in every way possible, both by combination and legislation. Debts must be collected, mortgages foreclosed as rapidly as possible. When through process of law the common people lose their homes, they will become more docile and more easily governed through the strong arm of the government applied by a central power of wealth under leading financiers. These truths are well known among our principal men, who are now engaged in forming an imperialism to govern the world. By dividing the voter through the political party system, we can get them to expend their energies in fighting for questions of no importance. It is thus by discreet action we can secure for ourselves that which has been so well planned and so successfully accomplished. And here we are. We have never been more divided through the political party system, wasting our energy fighting with each other about things they deliberately put in mainstream media to distract us, letting them rob us blind, enslave us, and commit the most egregious crimes against humanity. History is not only rhyming, it's nearly repeating itself. How is it that the United States was founded with the intention of keeping private central bankers out of the government, yet here we are, back to where we started? Well, it's very simple. Bankers are dedicated to schemes of acquiring our wealth, and they know how easy it is to corrupt a nation's leaders. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty, who is referred to as the founding father of international finance, said this famous quote, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws." One of Rothschild's chief supporters was Alexander Hamilton, who had actually married into the Rothschild family. And through his relationship with Hamilton, they were successful in setting up a private central bank called the First Bank of the United States as a way to assist the post-Revolutionary War economy, which effectively gave the Rothschilds control over the United States money supply. The private central bank was founded in 1791, and by the end of its 20-year charter, the United States was in ruins, all while the bankers flourished. So when Congress refused to renew the charter because of its utter failure, and instead intended to go back to the state-issued value-based currency where people paid no interest at all to bankers, the head of the private central bank, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, threatened the US government with a war. Congress held their position to not renew the charter, and then Rothschild tried to force British Prime Minister, at the time Spencer Perceval, to start a war with the US and take the colonies back. And when he refused to go to war, he was assassinated. In fact, he was the only British Prime Minister to be assassinated in office. Wild. So naturally, his replacement, Robert Banks Jenkins, was fully supportive of a war, and Rothschild financed it at virtually no interest. This was the War of 1812, and the goal was to recolonize the US, or put the US into such debt that they would be forced to accept a new private central bank, which is unfortunately what ended up happening. So even though the United States won the war, Congress was forced to grant a new charter for another private central bank that issued public currency and loans with interest. And it was called the Second Bank of the United States. And like clockwork, this private central bank brought the United States back into ruins, yet again with tons of debt, unemployment, and poverty. That is until Andrew Jackson came along, campaigning for president with the slogan, "Jackson and no bank." Jackson became president and blocked the renewal of the charter for the Second Bank of the United States with this famous quote, "Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I've had men watching you for a long time, and am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families? That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families. And that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. I have determined to rout you out. And by the eternal, I will rout you out." And he did. And not only that, he also routed out all of the national debt. Andrew Jackson was the only president of the United States to actually pay off all of the national debt. Then, surprise, surprise, an assassination attempt was made on Jackson, where fortunately for him, both pistols the attacker was wielding failed to fire. Crazy. So when the Second Bank of the United States lost its charter, it continued to operate as a regular bank and failed after about 5 years. Now, after Andrew Jackson, President Zachary Taylor came into office, and he also opposed the creation of a new private central bank, stating, "The idea of a national bank is dead and will not be revived in my time." Then, oddly enough, after eating a bowl of cherries and milk, he died, rumored to have been poisoned. Next up, President James Buchanan was in office. He also opposed a private central bank charter, set limits on banks issuing more loans than they had actual funds, and then he was also poisoned. But he actually survived while the other 38 people at the dinner died. Wow. Which brings us to the next war started by the bankers, the Civil War. That's right. When the Confederacy seceded from the United States, private central banks offered to fund President Abraham Lincoln's efforts to bring the South back into the Union at 30% interest. Lincoln responded by saying he would not free slaves by enslaving people to the bankers, and he used his presidential authority to issue a new government interest-free currency called the greenback. And so the bankers retaliated by sending a letter to every bank in the US urging them to fund the mainstream media at the time, newspapers, to oppose Lincoln's greenbacks. A quote from Lincoln says, "I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear is my greatest foe." And check this out. The bankers were urging Europe to support the Confederacy to defeat Lincoln's Union, where France and Britain were actually considering attacking the United States to help the Confederacy. However, Russia prevented them from doing so. Tsar Alexander II had just ended serfdom and had a state bank similar to the one the US was originally founded on, and he authorized Russian aid to Lincoln. Then, surprise, surprise, like the recurring pattern goes, multiple assassination attempts were made on him in 1866, 1879, and 1880 until a successful one was made in 1881. And after the Union won the war, Lincoln announced that he would continue issuing greenbacks. And then he was assassinated. And after he was killed, greenbacks were pulled from circulation and the US was forced to go back to private central banknotes with interest. Insane. Next up, we have President James Garfield, who was elected in 1880, who was in support of government-controlled money, and he was shot in 1881 and died a few days later. Then in 1896, President William McKinley was elected and favored gold-backed currencies, and he was shot in 1901 and died a few days later. Which brings us to 1910, when 6 of America's richest men had a secret meeting organized by J.P. Morgan on his property on Jekyll Island, where the idea for the United States' third private central bank was born. And side note, there's a conspiracy that there were 3 men that stood in J.P. Morgan's way of creating it: John Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim, that all happened to be on J.P. Morgan's boat, the Titanic, when it sank. Did big private central bankers sink the boat on purpose and get an insurance payout after it sank? Well, yes, JP Morgan got paid by the insurance company when his boat sank. Okay, after the Titanic sank, with potentially the only guys standing in the way of the creation of the United States' third private central bank in 1912, 1 year later, the third private central bank of the United States was created over the Christmas holiday in 1913, while Congress members who opposed it were at home. This was 111 years ago now, on December 23rd. And in order to push it through, the bankers promised President Woodrow Wilson generous campaign contributions if he signed the act, which he did. And they decided to name the bank the Federal Reserve, to make it seem like a quasi-governmental entity when it's actually not a government entity at all. It's not federal. It has no reserves. It's a pyramid scheme, private central bank. And another fun fact is that it's exempt from all taxation except property tax. Brilliant. And if you don't believe me, here's a video of former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, explaining how it's a private entity that doesn't answer to any government authority.
What is the proper relationship? What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter. And I've had a very good relations.
There you have it. And not even 7 months after the Federal Reserve was created, guess what happened? World War I in 1914. Mind you, there was no such thing as a World War before that. And a few years after that, in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson said this: "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." Sad. So, World War I started between Austria-Hungary and Serbia with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. However, media focus quickly shifted to Germany, a big economic threat to Great Britain. So even though Germany didn't even start the war, following the Treaty of Versailles, they were forced to pay the war costs to their own private central bank. Germany had gone into massive debt to pay for the war, massive inflation followed, and the Germans were trapped in endless debt to the private central bank. So when Hitler came into power, his first financial move was what we've seen already throughout history, shifting the country to their own state-issued, value-based currency, where they did not have to borrow money from private central banks at interest. And guess what happened? Germany's economy quickly turned around and started flourishing and media called it the German miracle. So once again, Germany became a threat to Great Britain, and their state-issued monetary system was also a threat to private central banks. And I think we're all starting to realize what happens when private central banks are threatened. Wars are waged and people are killed. Alright, so towards the end of World War II in 1944, the world's major economic powers met at a luxury resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, where they created the Bretton Woods Agreement for international finance. And ultimately, this caused the British pound to lose its status as the world's reserve currency to the US dollar and forced other nations to tie their currencies to US dollar under two conditions. One, the Federal Reserve would not overprint US dollars as a means to steal goods and services from other countries in exchange for devaluing the currency, like an imperial tax. And two, US dollars would always be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. And obviously both of those conditions were never kept because the Federal Reserve is a private central bank that doesn't have to answer to the US government or any other governing body. Amazing. Moving right along our timeline here, next we've got President John F. Kennedy. He understood the private central bank's agenda and wrote and signed Executive Order 11110 that ordered the US Treasury to issue a new government-backed currency called the United States Note. They were created by the US government, backed by the silver stockpiles held by the US government. About $4.5 billion went into public circulation. 5 months later, Kennedy was assassinated, and all of the United States notes were pulled from circulation and destroyed. Great. Listen up, here's something important to note about Kennedy's Executive Order 11110. It's actually still in effect, however, no president has been brave enough to touch it since. Back to the Fed, not upholding Bretton Woods Agreement. Eventually, other countries started noticing the large piles of US dollars they were accumulating in exchange for real goods and services. Like in the case of France, wine and cheese. Countries around the world started exercising their option under the Bretton Woods Agreement to exchange the paper notes for gold. However, since the Federal Reserve was overprinting money, the US government didn't have enough gold to redeem all of the requests. So by 1966, an estimated $14 billion was held by foreign banks, while the US government only had about $3.2 billion worth of gold. So President Richard Nixon had to temporarily suspend the convertibility of US dollars to gold, which obviously became permanent and ultimately ended the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971. And side note, interestingly enough, this was the same year that the World Economic Forum was founded. It was initially called the European Management Forum, with the goal of introducing European business to American management practices. Sheer coincidence? Or orchestrated by private central bankers looking to consolidate power? So once it became obvious that the US didn't have enough gold reserves to back its currency, faith in the United States' ability to pay off its debts decreased. And to combat this, Richard Nixon started the environmental movement with the EPA, which effectively allowed the government to use public lands as collateral on national debt under the guise it was being protected and kept pristine. So eventually about 25% of the United States land had been seized by the government and pledged to foreign countries as collateral. And with land in short supply, the US government made deals with the world's largest oil producing countries, where in exchange for only selling their oil for US dollars, the US would guarantee military protection for them. This is when the petrodollar system was born. So the US started effectively backing the US dollar with oil, other foreign countries' oil. Remarkable, isn't it? It's no wonder after the Desert Storm conflict, when Iraq wanted their rights to sell oil in euros instead of US dollars in the early 2000s, that the US reinvaded Iraq under the guise that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons he was going to use, when in reality, they did it just to get Iraq's oil transactions back to US dollars. And when Libya announced they were only going to sell their oil for their state-owned, value-based trade currency, the gold dinar, the US invaded Libya, killed their leader, imposed a private central bank, and put Libya's oil back on the market for US dollars only. And some of the Hillary Clinton emails released confirmed that the real reason the US invaded Libya was to counteract the threat of the gold dinar becoming a rival to the US dollar and petrodollar system. So what can we glean from history to piece together what may actually be going on and who stands to benefit from both the process and the outcome? Well, as the cycle goes, private banks issue currencies with interest, which forces countries and their people into more and more debt. Once the people and the government stop borrowing, wars are waged that force everyone into more debt to pay for the wars. After that, countries and people need to borrow more to rebuild. And when it's all said and done, everything is about the same except for more dead people, and the process repeats. So in the current situation, World War III will be an attempt to force the world onto a private central bank US dollar digital currency that is controlled by private central powers like the World Economic Forum, where they can dictate what we can and cannot buy, the amount of goods we can buy, and if we can buy anything at all. So is there hope for us? Do we stand a chance at rebuilding a better world together from the ashes of a more than likely extremely destructive world war? It's possible. Things are much different now with the internet, access to information, independent journalism, people becoming curious, looking for answers, and spreading awareness. So what can we do? We can be aware, talk about it with friends, family, and other people to spread awareness, share content like this online, educate as many people as possible. And we need to be prepared to weather a potential storm of capital controls, where countries start to restrict money flowing from their countries so they can continue using their private central bank currencies to enslave and control people. It will probably become harder to convert our fiat into hard assets. Like and subscribe for more. Be safe out there.